We are extraordinarily fortunate to be joined this morning by Francesca Albanese. She is an international lawyer and also the UN's Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So to start with, I wanted to get your reaction to some breaking news from yesterday. President Biden saying that he would halt some weapon shipments to Israel if they launch what he described as a major invasion into Rafah. Given what you know about the humanitarian situation on the ground in Gaza and in Rafah specifically, I wonder if you could speak to the significance of his comments.
I welcome this decision. I wish it had come earlier because the situation in the Gaza Strip is catastrophic. And of course, all the more in Rafah, where 1.5 million people are amassed, including 600,000 children. The fact that there is no new shipment of weapons sent to Israel, again, is positive, although I understand that Israel's reaction has been that they will use what I have.
So one of the things that we wanted to get from you is just a broader discussion of some of the case that you had brought forward or had argued before the ICC. So I'm wondering if you could give our audience, a US-based audience, a view into some of the case, that facts of the matter that you were able to discuss, why you think it is important now in this context, even with the war continuing.
Well, the ICC has jurisdiction over crimes of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, as well as the crime of aggression. I do not have the detail of how the ICC and the Office of the Prosecutor are qualifying the crimes they might have found in the context of their investigation in the situation of Palestine. But I, as you might know from my latest report presented to the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, I think that the grounds to believe that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza are there. So I'm anxious to see the ICC proceeding with hopefully arrest warrants, of course, both against Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders for what has happened on the 7th of October.
So, Francesca, in the context of your report, which found reasonable grounds to believe that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip, what Israel's defenders will say is they are working hard to avoid civilian casualties. In Rafah, they leafleted asking people to evacuate. They say, listen, what other country uses these sort of techniques to get civilians out of harm's way? That it is Hamas's fault that there has been such a high civilian death toll because they operate out of population centers and places allegedly like hospitals. What is your response to that critique of your analysis?
Well, this is not what has happened on the ground in Gaza for the past 7 months. And again, we are talking of over half a year of casualties and destruction. 70% of Gaza has been destroyed in terms of civilian infrastructure, including livelihood, essential livelihood. There is a total blockade that has been ongoing, which prevents unfettered aid, including water, food, medication, and fuel entering Gaza. This has been hampered over and over. And I reject the argument that they have tried to avoid civilian casualties, because 70% of the victims, of the reported victims of this conflict, have steadily been women and children. And so this has been the situation that should have been addressed from the first weeks of the conflict. There is another element that I collected by many victims and survivors that I've investigated over the past months. They said that since the very beginning, they realized that Israel was after something else with this war, because they have seen Israel hitting indiscriminately symbols of Palestinian civilian life, like universities, mosques, churches, again, essential livelihoods and hospitals. I also argue in the report that Israel has not rejected the allegations of the conduct that has taken place. They have differently qualified it, justifying it as in compliance with international humanitarian law, which I call humanitarian camouflage. Israel has justified by using international humanitarian law jargon its military operation. For example, saying, yeah, but we ordered evacuations. Even the first evacuation was an evacuation order that targeted 1.1 million people. And it was said in an area that, by the way, comprised 22 hospitals. And they said whomever remains behind will be considered a terrorist accomplice. And this is not the way to protect civilians. All the more, over 42% of the casualties during the first weeks and months of the conflict were in areas that had been identified as safe. This is very dangerous. It's an indication of how little precautions were taken. So the principle of distinctions between civilians and military and the principle of precautions were completely applied.
One question I had for you was, given that the U.S. and Israel, the two primary, the participants on this side of the war, are not party to the ICC, why do you believe that it was important to bring this case forward for your own participation if there isn't going to be any immediate enforcement on behalf of those two governments?
Well, there is a jurisdiction of the ICC over what happens in the occupied Palestinian territory. This is under the jurisdiction of the court, and this falls squarely in also the interest of Israel, because Israel is the occupying power in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. So, despite the fact that Israel is not a member, is not a party to the Rome Statute, it's directly affected by it.
Okay.
Francesca, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the current humanitarian situation on the ground. There have been reports. Israel is claiming that they've increased the amount of aid that is going into the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, you have Cindy McCain, the head of the UN World Food Program, saying that northern Gaza is in full-blown famine and that is rapidly creeping south. What can you say about the current situation, whether there has in fact been an increase in the amount of aid getting into Gaza?
That any increase is in the margins. Again, the situation in the Gaza Strip is beyond despair. This is the reality. And I keep on saying, if Israel disputes the figures that are provided by the United Nations, well, why doesn't Israel allow independent monitors to enter the Gaza Strip? Why Israel doesn't allow journalists to enter the Gaza Strip? This is the only conflict, if we want to call it like that has no foreign correspondence, and it's astonishing. The reality is dramatic. What I hear, not only from the United Nations, the humanitarian operators on the ground, but also from many survivors, is catastrophic. And I've seen it with my own eyes, visiting hospitals in the region where there are, especially those who have been evacuated from Gaza in the last weeks and months, they are severely malnourished, especially the children. So there is no question that famine has hit parts of Gaza heavily. And the north, whatever is above the Wadi Gaza, has been almost off limits to the entry of aid. Whatever has entered from the south has been heavily contingented, and so very, very limited. But also, it's impossible to deliver aid. This is something that UNRWA has denounced over and over. I mention UNRWA because is the agency which has the largest capacity to deliver aid in the Gaza Strip, and has been hampered by the bombing, the continuous bombing, which has never stopped, the huge destruction to the infrastructure, including roads, and the danger that this represents. So, especially now with the control that Israel maintains over the Rafah crossing, the United Nations are already saying that there is absolutely not enough aid that enters. There have been attempts to deliver food from the sea and from air, but I find it even a bit cynical, if you allow me to say so, because this aid has not been delivered according to humanitarian standards, to the no harm principle, and so it has been haphazard and even dangerous, even lethal in a number of cases, because the air drop has killed people in Gaza.
Francesca, as you know, the International Court of Justice is currently considering, courtesy of a case brought by South Africa, whether Israel is committing genocide and violating those conventions in the Gaza Strip. They issued a preliminary finding that was widely reported and understood to be that they found the case to be at least plausible. However, Joan Donoghue, who just retired as president of the ICJ, recently spoke with the BBC and indicated this was not the correct way to think about this initial finding. Let's take a listen to what she had to say, and then I want to get your reaction and breakdown on the other side.
I'm glad I have a chance to address that, because the court's test for deciding whether to impose measures uses the idea of plausibility, but the test is the plausibility of the rights that are asserted by the applicant, in this case, South Africa. So the court decided that the Palestinians had a plausible right to be protected from genocide, and that South Africa had the right to present that claim in the court. It then looked at the facts as well, but it did not decide, and this is something where I'm correcting what's often said in the media, it didn't decide that the claim of genocide was plausible. It did emphasize in the order that there was a risk of irreparable harm to the Palestinian right to be protected from genocide. But the shorthand that often appears, which is that there's a plausible case of genocide, isn't what the court decided.
Francesca, if you could help us understand what the court did and did not decide in terms of this ICJ potential genocide case.
Yes, I think that first of all, we need to understand that if there was no case to be heard over alleged genocide in Gaza, the case would have been stopped in its tracks, just as Israel requested. Instead, the ICJ issued a set of preliminary measures on the 26th of January and another on the 28th of March, and does not remove either the South Africa versus Israel, nor the Nicaragua versus Germany cases that are still pending. Now, the 26th of January order said there is a risk of irreparable harm to the Palestinian right to be protected from genocide. The risk can only exist if someone is plausibly threatening that right. So it seems to me that there is a confusion over semantics. So the plausible right at risk is the right not to be genocided.
So a bigger and more philosophical question. In your report, you wrote about the anatomy of a genocide. Could you define for us what genocide means, I guess, under international law and by the United Nations, and then give us some historical examples other than the Holocaust of what we should look to so that people can wrap their heads around it?
I'm glad you asked me this question, Saagar, because especially in the Western world, I find that there is a huge confusion over what genocide means. And there is, of course, and it should be so. I mean, the Holocaust should remain ingrained in our memory, especially I speak as a European, and the Holocaust should never be forgotten, and what led to the Holocaust should not be forgotten. At the same time, what constitutes genocide is not established necessarily by presidents or personal opinion or personal experiences, painful as they are. What constitutes genocide is established by Article 2 of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And genocide is defined as a set of acts committed with intent to destroy a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group in whole or in part as such. And it includes a series of acts like killing members of the group, infliction of severe bodily or mental harm to members of the group, or the creation of conditions of life that would lead to the destruction of the group, to mention the three cases that I found relevant in the case of genocide. Of course, the threshold is very high, because one is to prove not only the intent to commit those crimes, but also the intent to destroy the people in whole or in part, the protected group in whole or in part through these acts. So the specific intent to commit genocide. The
So
other example, history,
Yeah,
let me say, history is replenished of incidents and cases of genocide. The very history of colonialism is replenished of genocidal ideology and practices. And this is something that we understand very well if we read the important literature that has been left, including by Raphael Lemkin, the scholar who gave the world the term genocide.
Francesca, why would a finding of genocide matter from the ICJ? Because as has been, reported and is always discussed when this case is discussed, the ICJ doesn't really have enforcement powers. So what does it even matter what they do? What does it even matter if this term actually comes to be applied to Israel's actions with regard to the Palestinian people and specifically in the Gaza Strip? What's your response to that on the potential impact of this case?
Krystal, your question is very important because while the ICJ determination in conclusions is critical to establish state responsibility over the crime of genocide, the Genocide Convention refers to the need to and the obligation to prevent genocide. I would like to say that the ICJ conclusions and measures, including provisional measures, are binding. So while the direct enforcement relies upon states, it's very important that the compass is established by the ICJ. Similarly important is the finding, the investigation and the conclusions of national courts and the ICC, who then have the responsibility to identify individual criminal liability. But again, the obligation to prevent genocide is triggered by the risk that genocide is being committed. And for me, that moment was reached on the 26th of January when the court concluded that there is a plausibility of risk for the rights protected under the Genocide Convention for the Palestinians in Gaza. Why is it important? It's important because these instruments and these mechanisms are the one leading to justice. But for me, the very existence of a convention which has in itself the obligation, which is erga omnes, applies to all member states, including those who are not party to the Genocide Convention, to prevent genocide, giving the gravity of this crime is necessary. I mean, we cannot wait for the determination of a court to prevent genocide. Otherwise, a genocide might be committed.
My question is, the defense here in the United States by the Israelis is that mass civilian death is, frankly, just, I guess, part and parcel, as they would put it, of an urban military campaign. The Israeli defenders have been pointing to U.S. and Iraqi military actions in the city of Mosul. There have been previous comparisons to the number of civilian casualties who were incurred in the Second World War. How do you think about the difference between those two or three examples? What level of civilian casualty is accepted? How do you parse intent whenever you are writing your report and you're thinking, as you said, through the genocide conventions?
I think that the arguments that have been offered and that you quoted for me are a way to divert the attention from what is happening on the ground and the need to have scrutiny over Israel's practices. This is not a case like any other, because Israel is the occupying power in the Gaza Strip and so should take the utmost precautions in ensuring that the occupied population is protected and is spared from the grievous impact of any conflict. Now, and this is not the first conflict that has occurred in Gaza. This is the sixth, of course, the most violent. Again, I go back to the point that I said in the beginning. The action that Israel has taken have been indiscriminate and have targeted civilians. There is no question about that. But this is something that I reflect from the very first days of this revengeful military operation against the Gaza Strip, because the very idea of targeting Hamas, going after Hamas, considering anyone as a terrorist was very dangerous, was very blurred. Where is the distinction between the civilians and the combatants? We know that who can be targeted under international humanitarian law are active combatants. So even a soldier, including Israeli soldiers, cannot be targeted unless they are in active combat. And if they have surrendered, they need to be respected. They can be taken prisoners, but they cannot be executed. So there is a respect for the right to life in international humanitarian law, so in situation of conflict, which is minimal. It's not absolute. And at the same time, this is the minimum threshold not to fall into complete brutality, cruelty, and lack of humanity. So what has happened in Gaza is, again, Israel has justified its actions like, okay, we have killed all this many people because there were human shields. Where is the evidence? We know from the investigations that Israelis in themselves, Israeli journalists have carried out, that artificial intelligence has been deployed up to the point that in order to target one Hamas fighter or combatant, and a risk up to 100 people has been calculated. So there have been instances and documented instances like in Jabalia camp where 100 people were killed and 100 people were injured just because there was one military combatant allegedly there. We don't know if in active combat or not, who was present. Again, these are not precautions and this is not respectful of the principle of distinction. So even if there was a legitimate reason to start a war against the Gaza Strip, the way it has been the way it has been conducted is absolutely against any basic principle of international humanitarian law.
We also have a lot of statements from senior Israeli officials, some of which you document in your report, some of which are documented in the South African case at the ICJ, that seem to indicate genocidal intent, talking about no uninvolved civilians, describing everyone in Gaza as animals, reference to biblical Amalek, et cetera. How important are those statements from Israeli officials? Now, what they would say is, oh, this is just heat of the moment. This is populist rhetoric. It's not actually being translated into policy. So how significant and consequential do you find those statements to be?
No, indeed, if we look at the international jurisprudence, for example, stemming from the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia or for Rwanda, we can definitely see that statements of officials per se do not constitute the hardcore evidence to prove that there is genocide. In fact, what I claim is that on the one hand, there has been, and I look at the legal documents that have animated this or have led this military campaign, but also what has happened on the ground, because those words that you have, those horrible words that you have mentioned in the beginning have resonated, have reverberated, have been internalized and acted upon by soldiers on the ground. I mean, it's been really soul-consuming, heartbreaking to see the self-incriminatory videos that Israeli soldiers themselves have posted on social media, and a significant number of whom I had verified, including the technical experts, where they claim to have hit entire neighborhoods as a revenge against the animals who carried out the 7th of October attack. And they have often quoted this language, the Amalek. They have talked of the full destruction of Gaza, and soldiers have repeated, we came here to destroy, to occupy, and to settle. And this is something that again, as they could so powerfully across the infantry that has been deployed on the ground, that it is really scary.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that we reached... sorry, go ahead.
Let me say, Saagar, just I think it's important to complement what I said in the beginning. So in order to determine whether there is genocide, we need to find the intent, and intent cannot be determined only on the words and oral statements of policymakers, but can be inferred. And again, when there is such a nature, scale, and patterns of conduct that speak to the same intent, and there is a reality and the capacity to carry out genocide, well, this is where the intent becomes auspicious and ostentatious.
One of the reasons that we reached out to you originally was a response from the U.S. State Department where they appeared to imply that you were anti-Semitic. So we have some of the comments here from the State Department spokesperson, Matt Miller, and we'll get your reaction. Let's take a listen.
We have for a long-standing period of time opposed the mandate of this special rapporteur, which we believe is not productive. And when it comes to the individual who holds that position, I can't help but note a history of anti-Semitic comments that she has made that have been reported.
She made anti-Semitic comments?
She has, and comments she made in December that appeared to justify the attacks of October 7th. So I think it's important to take that into account. But With respect to the report itself, we have made clear that we believe that allegations of genocide are unfounded.
So we wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
Okay, first of all, the US has never considered this, has always contested, like Israel, the value of this mandate. And this is something that precedes me and has little to do with my persona. While the comments of the spokesperson had to do very much with my persona. And I was appalled when I heard that a senior US official could spread these lies, because they are lies. First of all, I've never, ever justified, it's appalling, I've never justified the 7th of October attacks. I've said that these acts were brutal, were criminal, and I've said that there should be there is an absolute need to have investigation and prosecution of those crimes. I've said also we need to understand where this hatred comes from. What I have rejected is the qualification of those acts as motivated by anti-Semitism, because first of all, there is no evidence of it. The second thing is that there are Israeli scholars themselves who say that it's very responsible to put the burden on what has happened on alleged anti-Semitism of Palestinians, because this deresponsibilizes Israel and decontextualizes the horror that has taken place in the occupied Palestinian territory for 56 years, which might have fed their hatred. So again, I push back on this allegation. The allegation of anti-Semitism is repulsive, as disgusting for me is anti-Semitism. As a human rights lawyer, I'm engaged against anti-Semitism, against against Islamophobia, Arabophobia, any form of discriminations, including anti-Palestinian racism. And what I really very much reject is that the allegation of anti-Semitism is used more and more to distract from Israel's responsibility, which is something that also not only betrays what anti-Semitism is, but creates new dangers for the Jewish people wherever they are. We need to distinguish what is Judaism and what is Israel's conduct. And I've always said, and I'm on record, I've always said any Jewish person is allowed to have all the feelings and love for Israel they want. What I stand against is the unconscionable stance of governments in sheltering Israel from accountability and which protracts its impunity.
Well, Francesca, I guess you can take comfort in the fact that you are far from alone in being labeled as anti-Semitic for your views with regard to what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip. I'm sure you're familiar with the discourse here, including from the President of the United States, about the campus protesters that have, these protests have really taken off across the country. Students who are calling for a ceasefire, who are calling for the U.S. to end their support for what they see as you do as a genocide. I wanted to get your reaction to Speaker of the House Mike Johnson made some very noteworthy comments on Holocaust Remembrance Day about these protests and the character of these protests. Let's take a listen to that.
The very campuses which were once the envy of the International Academy have succumbed to an anti-Semitic virus. Students who were known for producing academic papers are now known for stabbing their Jewish peers in the eyes with Palestinian flags. And with our survivors before us, if you close your eyes in the quietness of your own heart, you can almost hear the glass of Jewish storefronts shattered by stormtroopers. You could see fathers being executed at point blank in the ghettos. You can feel a brother's hand slipping out of his sister's as men in uniforms separate them into lines, and they can only mouth to one another, "Everything will be okay," hoping that it would be.
So, Francesca, first, just to correct the record, there are no documented incidents of anyone being stabbed with the eye by a flag or any other thing. Just wanted to put that out there. But here you see the Speaker of the House labeling American students, equating them to Nazis, very much echoing the rhetoric of Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu. This has been used to justify quite an extensive crackdown and criminalization of these protests. I wonder what your reaction as an international human rights lawyer is, both to this language, but also to the response to these campus protests.
Well, let me react on the remarks first. I find Speaker Johnson's remarks both infelicitous and inaccurate. The comparative allusions of college campus protests against Israel's conduct in Gaza, because this is what we are talking about, to anti-Semitism, to the heinous, awful, revolting anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust, is not only historically inappropriate, but also functions to divert the attention from the substantive issues at hand, namely the growing body of evidence regarding the atrocity crimes committed in Gaza, that clearly this young generation globally across the world cannot stomach anymore. I also found that this rhetorical tactic, exploiting the memory of the Holocaust, instrumentalizing one of the history's gravest atrocities for contemporary purposes, is unacceptable, because it undermines the gravity and uniqueness of the Holocaust while simultaneously obscuring the pressing concerns in the occupied Palestinian territory. And I believe that as we aim to foster a constructive and respectful discourse, it is crucial that historical comparisons are made with careful considerations of their accuracy and their implications. And going to the protests in US campuses, I can tell as a European, this is spreading across the world. Anyone, including, I live in an Arab country, and everyone is looking at these young people as the most courageous. And I do share this view. So I keep on saying, I hope that they stay peaceful and respectful and isolate any element that might represent a threat to anyone in the university. But I also want to say that there are many Jewish students among them. And again, and this is what gives me hope, that the new generation doesn't buy anymore what has been the narrative sold by Israeli leadership until nowadays.
Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur, thank you so much for taking some time with us this morning. We're extremely grateful. We know you're very busy.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.